Welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Today we have Reza John Vedadi. He's joining us from London, and he's going to tell us about film and the representation of Islam. So look forward to an interesting discussion, and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on your wonderful show. I'm an avid follower.
Oh, that's great. It's nice to interact with some of our fans. And for other fans listening, if you have an interesting skill set or knowledge base and you want to have a chat, we're open to it. So just leave comments and we can have a discussion with everyone. So
Exactly.
Why don't you tell us about your what you found in your PhD in on the topic of basically like Hollywood as propaganda against Islam?
Sure. So when I started out my PhD, the first aspect I was going to look at was Hollywood's interaction or representation of the Muslim identity. And that then would incorporate looking at, I don't know, maybe like 15, 16 countries that are Muslim majority countries. And that came to almost 200 films. And my supervisor is like, look, you're not going to be able to analyze 200 films in an in-depth way. Even though PhD is like 100,000, 90,000 words, it's not enough, right? So then I narrowed it down to 4 countries that are in conflict with American foreign policy. And those countries are Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and Palestine. And so within that identity, when I was analyzing and quantifying data, aspect of it is the Muslim identity, but then you also have their ethnicities. So also the Iranian and or Iraqi, you have the citizen identity, because within Iraq you have, for example, Kurds and Arabs, and within Iran we have Kurds, Arabs, Persians, Azerbaijanis, Baluchi, so all different ethnicities. So it was interesting for me to see if in Hollywood films, and I'll tell you why I chose Hollywood and what Hollywood means, and the date range that I was looking at. So I was looking at 1979 till about 2019, 40 years, right? 4 decades. That would allow enough time to not, blame a specific director. It would be looked at overall, because there'll be like directors coming in, film scripters coming in, producers coming in, who would produce different films. So you can't say it's a specific, group of set of directors that are, providing a specific representation. And Hollywood, when you search Hollywood are 5 or 6 major studios. And these major studios are Disney, Warner Brothers, Universal, Paramount, and Columbia, which is owned by Sony now. And 20th Century Fox, but that got bought out by Disney about 3-4 years ago. So they kind of produce about 86-87% of all the films that are released in cinemas in North America, which is US and Canada. So I focused on them. There are independent films or smaller studios that are quite large, but because they only counted for about 10 to 15%, I wanted to focus on the major studios. So looking at these 4 countries, I had to then decide, well, what is it I'm comparing them to? What is it I'm analyzing? So I wanted to analyze it to something specific, which is American foreign policy. So I looked at 1979 because a lot of stuff happened in 1979. And not the obvious one that you're going to think of. I'm going to add some extra ones and then we'll come to the obvious one. So in 1979, we had the Soviet, military entering Afghanistan. When you do research, you find out that the Afghan government at that time was a socialist communist government, and they invited them in. So it's not the word invasion is not accurate in itself because they were invited in. Then you had the US embassy being burned and ransacked in Pakistan, Islamabad. You had the holy Grand Mosque in Mecca being taken over by a Saudi individual who claimed to be the Mahdi. There was the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. And the last, well, actually 2 more. The one before the last, Iranian Revolution. And in the same year, the takeover of the American embassy in Tehran. So you had all of...
Right.
Wasn't also in that year the terrorism conference that Israel had? Wasn't that 79? The conference
Possibly.
where they kind of launched the idea of turning Islam into a terror threat. I forget what it was called. It's like a pinnacle event in Israeli foreign policy. They launched this. I think it was like even Netanyahu was at that conference, and it was like I forget what it was called, the terrorism something conference. Wasn't that the year? It was where they
I don't remember
I
either.
haven't seen it. I haven't seen it, but
9/11.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't surprise.
Okay.
So 1979, all of this stuff happens, and you have massive power. Oh, another thing, Saddam Hussein comes into power. So you have all of these things that are shifting the politics within West Asia. I don't use Middle East. And ever since I've been writing my PhD, I find it hard to type it and to say it. The reason being the word Middle East was invented in 1855 in British India office. So they wanted to denote and kind of describe the area between the British Empire in Europe and the East India Empire Company, or East India Empire that belonged to the British. The part between that was, Iran and Iraq and all these places, Middle East. At that time, it wasn't Iraq. It would have been the Ottoman Empire. So I prefer to call it
colonialist term.
It's a colonialist term, invented by the British. And when you say Middle East, why are we saying middle of the East to what, right? But when you say West Asia, you are being accurate because it's Asia and it's the west of it. Anyway, so that's a quick history of that. So in West Asia, all of these things were happening. Now, America at one point was shall I continue? Yeah. So America at that point lost the policeman of the region, right? Which is the Mohammad Reza Shah. And so all of this stuff is happening in Iraq, and Israel's making peace with Egypt, and so a lot of stuff was happening. So I wanted to see how these countries, so Afghanistan at that time wasn't in conflict with America. They didn't have relations, but the Americans started, if you remember, in the 80s, supporting the group of people outside of the major cities and kind of building this whole Mujahideen group with the Saudi funding to counter the Russians, to push them out, the Soviets, sorry. And in Iran, relations got cut after the embassy takeover, and they've never been restored. In Iraq, the relations were never full relations because Saddam was a Ba'athist socialist. However, they were not like in Iran, it wasn't cut. So when the war happened and he invaded Iran, he received support from America. And if you remember the famous video of Donald Rumsfeld in, I think, 82 or 84, is going to Saddam and shaking his hand. He was Under Secretary of Defense, I think, at that time, saying, yeah, we're going to provide you with weapons and so forth. And Palestine wasn't even recognized by America. There was no PLO at that time. There was no recognition of anything. So, all of these started to fluctuate after 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So that's the kind of, I try to give you a quick introduction to what I was looking at for my PhD.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk about how it relates to, I think there's been a lot of work on talking about how Arabs have been demonized in film, and I think that relates directly to the Israeli occupation, because they knew, and the investors in that early on were associated with the sort of Jewish mob families in America, and they were big investors in Hollywood, and then it just happened to somehow correspond directly to U.S. geopolitical interests at some point. So there was also state interest in that narrative continuing, so that we could, as a nation, agree that yes, these Muslims in Palestine are the enemy, and they're obviously subhuman and all that. So I think that's been talked about enough. But what's interesting is also the Persian dynamic. So I don't know if you found specifically propaganda that targeted
yes,
Persian
Islam.
I'd be very interested in knowing about
out
that.
of that date range that I had a look at, there were 17 films that fell into it that specifically referred to the Iranian identity. And so, but I had to figure out a way of, so there was the content analysis of finding factual things. A film that represents Iran or Iranian identity. It shows, for example, act of terrorism or support of terrorism, nuclear, blah 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 blah. These things that I had made categories
like
for.
linking Iran to nuclear weapons, because I'm sure that that's happened in the last.
I'll give you examples. I'll give you examples as we discuss. Yeah. So they had that, but not as much as I thought they would have, which is really interesting because it's something that they've been bashing on for about 10, 15 years constantly. I would thought there would be so many more movies, but it wasn't. It was more things to do with terrorism and just like kind of negative Orientalist tropes and representations. So 17 films, and out of those 17 films, some depicted Iranians and some didn't. They just referred to the Iranian identity. And so I had to create for my PhD, for my research, a formula that now I can apply to anything. Anyone can apply to anything. And it's 4 tiers. The first tier is basically in a film where Iranian identity is just referred to, but not shown. So Rush Hour 3, Chris Tucker playing the LA cop speaks to his captain, and he's saying, the captain says, look at the mess you made, like that time, with when you arrested those Iranians. And Chris Tucker says, yeah, but they were terrorists. And the captain says, no, they weren't. They weren't. They were actually scientists. He goes, yeah, but they're all terrorists. Right?
Wow.
So that's yeah. So go back to Rush Hour 3 and you see that. Wow. So that's in there, right? So you don't see an Iranian, but Iranians are mentioned. So you have level 1. That's the level 1. Then level 2 is Iranians in the background. So they're doing stuff, you see them, but they don't have any specific dialogue or role. They're just in the background. And so if you remember the film, it's a comedy film.
Which year was Rush Hour?
Rush Hour would be 2007. Okay. 2007. And so there was Airplane 2. It's one of those like wacky comedies in the same kind of tone as the Naked Gun series with Leslie Nielsen, that kind of stuff, right? So in that you see, I mean, some of them are funny. I mean, as Iranian, I get offended.
There's like a sheikh or a mullah or something.
Oh no, so that's Cannonball Run. That's Cannonball Run.
Isn't there one on the plane though? In Airplane?
So there is no in the Airplane. The Iranians are represented like this. It's right at the beginning of the movie, within the first 2 minutes, and this van comes up, and it says on it, Iran Air shuttle, yeah. And it's the way it is 2 men come out with weapons, and they have the Arab shafia, the Arab scarf the men wear. Right. They grab and they're kind of pushing the passengers off the Iran Air shuttle. So it's funny because, that's a service you get from an airline, but it's done as if terrorists are hijacking the sea, or it's just that kind of reference. So,
but the Iranians are so
programs Iran into that, like.
So that's that. So yeah, I mean, it says Iran, so you can't. And but then they're shown. So another thing that I picked up in that one scene was that you see them as Arabs.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Like, yes. The 2 men were dressed as Arabs, so it's like a combination of like demonizing Arabs and Iranians, and mixing
the identities. Yeah,
race and the culture of Iran. That's, I think, the main thing that propaganda does about Iran in America is that it muddles the difference between Persia and Arabia. And
it gets better as they go along. They become more sophisticated and present Iran. You think, oh wow, this looks like Iran, but it's still the Orientalist. I'll demonstrate in a minute. So that's level 2. So you see them, but they don't have any specific dialogue or specific role. They're just in the background. So then there's level 3. In level 3, the depiction. You can apply this to any representation of any minority in any media. In level 3, if you remember Naked Gun 1, where at the beginning of the movie, right, there's a table, and on it is Idi Amin, Yasser Arafat, Gorbachev, Gaddafi, and 1 or 2 other people, and Imam Khomeini is sitting at the head. He's like he's the head of the table, like, and they're like, right now we must attack them, we must do this, we must do that, and then Imam Khomeini is like, no, we have to give them at least one terror attack. We must conduct one terror attack this week to show them that they're cowards and stuff like that. So now he has dialogue. He's actually saying something. It's like a 2, 3, 4 minute scene, and then Leslie Nielsen takes his his clothes off. He's pretending to be undercover, and then starts beating all of them up and says, "Don't let me catch you in America," and then jumps out the window, right? So that scene doesn't add to the film in the sense that when you watch the rest of the film, it doesn't contribute anything to the film. It's not part of the story. There's no development, but the characters have dialogue, and it's more of a depiction. But then you have level 4 depiction, the final level.
It was like one of the financiers of that film was probably like a Zionist, and he was like, "Yeah, I'll fund your film, but you got to put something in there." Like, and they were like, "All right, we'll just throw this scene in about punching Iranians."
Well, I'll mention another film that I only found out after watching for the past 30 years. Only, I think, a month or 2 ago, that there's a quick clip in it that depicts Imam Khomeini, and I didn't even realize until I don't know how it just popped up I saw it, and then I included it in my research for a presentation I'm doing. And so the final level of depiction is one that the country of Iran or Iranians have an impact on the plot and the story. They either drive the path of the story or that. And one of those, 2 that will come to your head. One will be Not Without My Daughter, or Argo. Like, without Iran or the Iranian characters, there is no story. It literally just, there's no point. Now, having level 4 depiction doesn't mean it's going to be a positive representation. It just goes to show that the character or identity of Iran or Iranians has an important part to the story. Without it, the story won't work. So these are the 4 categories that I found in my research.
Yeah, if you let me jump in there. So the ones that you mentioned so far, except for Argo, are actually representing the Islamic Republic of Iran, or the citizens of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But it's Argo, which is actually a historical distortion of Persians, and is that correct? Like, can you tell me
all
more
of them
about
kind
Argo
of
and how Iranians are represented?
Yeah, so all of them are set after the revolution. All of those films, right? Every film that I've researched.
Yeah, but the story is
Not Without My Daughter shows the Iranian Islamic identity as well, because inside it is his Islamic identity, praying and religion, and they saw a sheikh, and images of Imam Khomeini are popped up when she's stressed out and she's running away from her husband who's about to beat her. Like, quick images are edited in of important personalities in Iran and so forth. So all of the films depict Iran after the revolution in those films that I analyzed. And not all of them depict religious identity. So there was a film which I don't know if you've seen, it's with Jeff Goldman from 1985. It's called Into the Night. They had Michelle Pfeiffer in it. They're running away from Iranian criminals. And interestingly enough, the head of the criminal family is a woman. So Iranian woman, she's a what's it called? A property magnate. And she's basically trying to get her hands on the certain expensive jewelry that was supposed to be smuggled into America from Europe that belonged to the Shah. But in the film, there's no mention of Islam. There's no mention of Islamic Republic. And it's directed by John Landis, the guy who directed...
But you understand that the story was happened or was set after the revolution, or
yes. So they say, when the Shah blah blah blah, and you find out it's after the Shah has fled and whatever, but then there is no attack on Iranian Islamic identity or anything like that. But Iranians are not necessarily shown in a positive way, because even though it's a comedy, and there's parts of it I even laughed at, but Iranians shown as criminals. They're shown as being dumb in their criminality sometimes, but there's no mention of religion or Islamic Republic in that one. So then there was the 4 films. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 films that showed the level 4 depictions, right? Which was Argo, Not Without My Daughter, Into the Night I just mentioned, and another one called Bodies of Lies. Now, if you remember, Bodies of Lies was starring Golshifteh Farahani, right?
Yeah.
With Leonardo
DiCaprio.
Now, she's supposed to be in the film. Her dad's Iranian exiled. That's all she says. So then you assume, okay, he must have left Iran for whatever reason, but that's it. But within the film, and then she's half, I think, Palestinian, so half Iranian, half Palestinian. But within the film, she's shown in a respectful way. She carries herself in a respectful way. Leonardo DiCaprio kind of falls in love with her, but there's nothing that demonstrates her kind of needing him to save her, unlike some other female characters that we see that kind of need saving or whatever. In this case, she's a strong individual, so it's hard to say it's a negative. It's not. It's fairly a positive representation, and the importance of her to make it a level 4 is he has to do something that he doesn't want to do in the story because he thinks that she's kidnapped by the Jordanian Secret Service, and if he doesn't do it, she'll get killed. So he changes his intention of what he wants to do, which changes the direction of the story because of her. So she has that impact on the story. So there was only 4 films that had that kind of nuanced representation. The other ones I can go into, but they were not as impactful like this into the story.
But Bodies of Lies is also kind of a misrepresentation of Muslims and Arabs in general, right? I mean, it's not specifically Iranians.
So when they show the Arabs in Iraq, because it's supposed to be between Iraq, Syria, whatever, there is that kind of negative representation in there. The streets are dirty. It's filmed in a specific way, and all those stuff.
There's just conflicts.
Yes. Yeah. So when I focused, so it's funny because some films would fall into both Iran and both into Iraq chapters, because they'll show Iraq, Iraqis in a certain way, and they'll show Iranians in another way. There was one positive film. I mean, it was called The Three Kings. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's with George Clooney, Mark Wahlberg.
Those guys, they're like ex-soldiers or whatever.
No, so they're soldiers from 1991 war. It was made in 1999, but it was 1999 war, and they go in to get gold, but then they get caught up in Saddam's brutal treatment of the Shias. And so Shias are shown in there very accurately because the actors that were brought in were actually Iraqi Shias from Dearborn. And so when you hear them speak, it's in Iraqi accent, dialect, and they were from the south of Iraq. And so it humanizes and provides much more nuance than any other film. It's one of the actually best representations in my research that I found. But within
but probably with the aim of like fueling the Shia Sunni conflicts, not with good intentions. I would never think they had good intentions of
whitewashing
correctly.
Whitewashing the idea of good soldiers is what it is. It's like, oh, American soldiers, they're just really good guys.
They are. They turn out to be a hero. But also, there's a part where the Iraqi Shias save the Americans, which is unusual. So and the director of it, he was an activist before he became a film director. His name is something Russell, and so when he went in, I think he was a photojournalist as well, and so he went in with slight different intention than some other directors who just go in and quickly want to get something out, use whatever stereotypes that are out there. So he tried to be more genuine, and so I do give him credit for that. And Iran, the way Iran is represented in that film is the Shias are trying to get away from southern Iraq because Saddam's troops are being brutal, and their haven is Iran, and so they just need to get across that border where the Iraqi soldiers are, and that's when the American soldiers step in to assist them to get across, and they get to Iran. So Iran is a haven, and it's interesting because one of the characters at the beginning of the film is quite racist in the movie, right? Played by Spike Jonze, the director, and so he, refers to Arabs as sand N-word, right? So it's a comedy movie, but you can see he's racist. By the end of the movie, because he's injured and he knows he's dying, the Iraqis mention to him that there's a holy place in Qom in Iran, one of the holy cities in Iran, that whoever's buried there, all their sins will begin and they'll go to heaven. And he goes, take me there. So by the end of the film, you see the arc of this person who started out racist towards Arabs. By the end of it, and Muslims, by the end of it, he wants to be married with Muslims and he feels connected with them. So this was really one of 2 films that I found that really provided a very more nuanced understanding of the Muslim identity. But the other ones,
that kind of stuff, the director, he really produces good content. I think it's interesting to look at Argo, for example, because I think Argo is a great example of a Hollywood limited hangout with the intelligence. I
have some stories about Argo as well for you.
And I was just gonna say, like, Who was the guy? It wasn't Leonardo DiCaprio, was it? Who executive produced Argo? It wasn't one of those.
George Clooney, I think.
Clooney, yeah, okay, yeah, Clooney, and he's an interesting character.
So he also made Syriana, if you remember, right?
I've actually met him once, but yeah, he's produced a lot of CIA affiliated propaganda.
Yeah.
Not just in films, but in his philanthropy supporting the Enough Project and.
Well, if you look at it, there is that whole deep state, and the deep state is not Republican or Democrat. It's the deep state. It's like the third party, right? That kind of runs the other two, right?
Well, so from film, it's interesting because they just lay it on the table. So, like, he also produced Syriana, I think.
Yeah.
And Syriana is another fantastic example in that same. I think they were within a few years of each other. That same time period where the CIA was really trying to pump out, disinformation, and so they did these limited hangouts where they knew the public was getting more information about the war on terror and what was going on, and they knew there was stuff coming out, and so they were like trying to get on top of that by releasing a groundbreaking film which exposed some reality, and people were like, oh, this must be true because it goes along with all the stuff I've found out to be true from alternative sources, and then it's still like gatekeeps the actual truth.
It's like The Intercept. You read that, you think The Intercept is going to open up, but it's really a deep state too, right? So that's how these
5 minutes it wasn't, and then it became completely.
It got taken over, and so Syriana, he does try to represent some countries that are actual from the that region, and some invented countries in the story, and in Argo, so the when the script was written, it was written with the kind of influence of the Tony Mendez who wrote the book, who is the character that Ben Affleck plays, right?
Yeah.
And so he would come in and kind of input into the script before it comes to the film stage, ideas, and the script writer would kind of resist.
And he was a CIA, was or is a CIA.
Yeah, he was a CIA operative. Yeah.
So like. And I've read his books. I didn't read that one, but I read his other stuff, and it's just trying to like make something fantastical, and so that it injects ideas into you. It's like it's not a genuine retelling of someone's life. It's so
no, yeah. I mean, obviously for the film also it's dramatized a lot. But you start to see when I actually spoke to some of the filmmakers in Hollywood, I managed to get hold of 5 or 6 and had a conversation, some through email, some on Zoom, and they opened up to me and said, so when they spoke to me, I realized that Hollywood isn't one big table where everyone's sitting around with the CIA and the Pentagon and they're getting told what to do. There are ways of influencing them, which are direct and indirect. So one of the ways that Pentagon influences films directly is through providing equipment. So, you can film on our, what's it called, ships. You can film on our airport bases. You can have some tanks, helicopters.
They have an office.
However,
that just gives free stuff to Hollywood if they give good.
Well, it's not free because it comes with a price tag, and that price tag is they need to confirm the script.
Right. They confirm the script, but also in the script, in confirming the script, the military obviously has to be presented. They're not going to show they're not going to give you free equipment to show the My Lai massacre in its true form. Or
no. They will change the script. They will say to you, you need to change this, remove this character.
So Ghraib as like a.
And I'll give you an example. If you remember Iron Man, the first one, right? When it came out, he goes through this whole transformation and then whatever. The original script, a couple of years before that, it was his father who was a weapons dealer, and Tony Stark was originally a pacifist and hated his father making weapons. But the Pentagon had made the studio go through so many transfers of the script before they can get access to weapons that the story changed. It became Tony Stark, who was a weapons designer, and he goes through this process of not allowing, becoming, I don't know, upset that his weapons kill people. So then he goes around killing people, right? Instead of his weapon, he becomes his most powerful weapon. So they have a lot of power in that sense, and a lot of Hollywood studios don't really care if it depicts the that region in a negative way, because there's not that much financial benefit for them to kind of resist what Hollywood wants. And I thought, well, maybe this is ideology, but then I realized capitalism has a big influence on this, because when you look at Hollywood, you hardly see any more films that depict Chinese in a negative way in the last 10 years. And why is that?
Because that's the money's coming from there.
Because it is a bigger film market than America right now. It's the biggest film market in the world.
And so that's, wasn't Disney actually like editing black people out of, like, black actors out of the posters for China? Like, they would have a cast or whatever.
Yes, yeah. I think it was Star Wars you're talking about. Star Wars.
Like black people, so they would like edit the famous black actor out so they could use that poster in China.
That's one thing, but another thing they did was I don't know if you remember the original Red Dawn, where Patrick Swayze fights the Soviets and the Cubans, right?
Yeah.
In the reversion with Christopher Hemsworth, came out, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. The American kids were fighting North Koreans and Russians.
Oh, I heard that. I never saw that version.
Now, originally, it wasn't North Koreans. Originally, it was Chinese.
Really?
So they had to go back, digitally change. So they had filmed everything. Then they realized this is not going to make any money in China. We're going to lose money. So they changed the flags digitally from Chinese to North Korean, and they changed the language spoken. They redubbed it.
That's why I didn't see the film, honestly, because I saw.
Well, it was a bad film. It was a rubbish film anyway.
That's a joke.
It was a rubbish film anyway. Yeah.
That's why I didn't see it. So like their re-editing of the film is definitely related to why I didn't see it personally.
So you start seeing that. You start seeing that. Maybe if Iran was a massive market for America, the Hollywood wouldn't play as as what's it called, as to the fiddle of US kind of foreign policy and stuff. Wow. But unfortunately,
it's US sanctions that doesn't allow Iran to be a market for Hollywood, because like everyone can watch every Hollywood movie for free, because we just know how to like illegally download things.
It's not illegal, though,
there's no way for us.
So
there's no way for us to pay for anything like online for coming from the US. So but can you tell me more about Argo and like what type of Persians or what era of Persian history it represents? And do you think the fact that this movie got a few Oscar awards, right? Was it because like the quality of the movie was really good, or do you think there are political issues that played into that? So can you tell us more about that?
So unfortunately, I used to, when I was growing up, I used to love the Oscars. I used to remember when it was VHS, and I think Chris might remember that era, because I can see some white hairs here. I used to program it because it'd be on so late in London, because it's, way back, we're 8 hours ahead. I would fall asleep, wake up in the morning, and I want to see it before any highlights are shown on the news or anything. And then as I got older and older, that glitz and glamour of Oscars started to fade, and I started to see the reality that Oscar is just a facade for a small group of industry people within the film industry to pat themselves on the back, not connected to the realities of the world, and also a way for the what's it called, the deep state, to influence films and give it recognition. And that's why Argo is an entertaining movie. If you're not Iranian, you're not going to get offended. Yeah, you can watch it. It's well made as editing and stuff like that. But it's not. There's so many other better movies from that year and other year that deserve Oscars that never got Oscars. And a lot of the times, if you look, for example, this year, I think it was the documentary went to the group of people that made documentary against the Russian dissident Navalny
or whatever.
Navalny.
It's such a joke.
The same way they gave Oscar to the White Helmets.
Exactly. It's what I was going to say.
Exactly. What a coincidence. Exactly.
That was a terrible documentary by any standard. So, I mean, it was once that happened, I was like, okay, this whole thing is a joke. I don't even pay attention to it anymore, because it's just political. It's just like the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, they give it to Obama, and then they give it to
in his first year.
It's like, oh, give me a break. Just throw it all in the garbage. Like,
Yeah, so it's things like that. You realize, okay, this whole stuff is just nonsense. I have to look at within between the lines. And so with Iran, if we go back to Argo, in it, the identities that are shown in a good way, and this is also same for Not Without My Daughter, which kind of traumatized me so much that it was the last film I watched for my PhD. So I had 62 films to go through, and I keep leaving it to the end because I was just subconsciously so traumatized me when I was a young kid. I didn't want to watch it, but
I remember it. And I have like mixed marriages between Muslims and Christians in my family, and so it was like for my family that film was very traumatic. And I remember as a kid, like my parents and whatever talking about this horrible like, and I was like, oh, so yeah. And that now knowing how it's propaganda is.
I think France. It was. I think it was World Cup, FIFA World Cup 1998 in France, when, like, you know, before the match or the same day as some countries have matches, they would broadcast a movie about that country, and they chose to broadcast Not Without My Daughter for Iran. And I remember all of us in Iran were really angry that and they were talking about that on TV. Yeah, because that was. It's a terrible one, and I think Iran contested. Yeah, they protested that, but I just remember that the reporters were talking about how this is like politically motivated and how this is so unfair of representing Iran.
I mean, part of it is politics, but also part of it is this deep-rooted Orientalist view of the East, and specifically Iran. That even if Iran right now gave up all of the things that they wanted, right? Said, look, we have no, like, for example, Saudi Arabia is an ally of the West and of all of these countries, right? They sell it weapons, and it has, you know, good relations, and it gives them oil. However, they will never portray Saudi Arabians in a positive way.
No, that's true.
You can look at The Kingdom, for example, and there's a few other films, right? So going back to Argo, and Not Without My Daughter, particularly, will read any film that depicts Iranian. I noticed that when they showed Iranians, especially the women, it's the women that are supportive of the Americans in defiance of Iran or Iranian interests that are shown in a positive way. Sure. So there's a maid in Argo. She knows that these people have just escaped from the U.S. embassy and the Secret Service or whoever is looking for them. He comes to the door. He says, "This, the Secret Service, Iranian Secret Service. Is there anyone in the house of, the ambassador who's the enemy to Iran, who shouldn't be here?" And she's like, "No." And so this person is depicted in a positive way because she supports American interests against Iran. Again, in Not Without My Daughter, the people who help Betty Mahmoudi escape Iran from her husband, right, are the women who help her and don't like the Islamic Republic or Islamic regime or whatever, right? And so you start seeing a pattern of people who are good depicted as people who provide support to American interests, and those who don't support American interests are the bad ones. And this, I think you mentioned something about the Persian era, or did you mean after the Islamic Revolution era?
No, I was actually, and I just realized I was thinking of another movie. It wasn't Argo. I know Argo was about the what they call the hostage crisis.
Yeah,
we call it the overtaking of the spy. Then that's how we call it in Iran. I was thinking of 300 actually.
Yes.
Did you look at 300s too?
So I didn't look at those ones because 300 is would fall technically before 1979, and so it was kind of like a fantasy, a rehash of history. And there was another one. There was Prince of Persia with Jake Gyllenhaal. There's no Persian in the whole film, but yeah, Prince of Persia based on a TV game from the 90s. But I didn't look at those because they didn't kind of fall in the parameter. But that, for example, it's very interesting. That is represented in a very Orientalist view of Iran, right? So you have King Xerxes, who, if you look at every single, I mean, you have people going upset because Cleopatra in a Netflix documentary is slightly shown with a bit more tan and maybe from our part of Africa. They, Egyptians are getting offended, and yet they represent Xerxes, who was by all accounts a great king. He managed to, I mean, there was wars and everything, I'm not going to defend that, but he managed to spread the Persian Empire to its largest extent, right? And and all the images of him carved on stone and everything, and all Persians are never in the way that it was in 300, or the men who
that's what I mean. Why, like, it's basically historical distortion, and it's not even about the Islamic Republic. It's demonizing Persians and Persian history in
but
general.
They kind of fall together. You see, this is the problem when you look at it as someone who's from outside. Kind of like Arabs and Persians and Iranians and Muslims and 4,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago, 10 years ago, it all kind of meshes together, because this concept of Orientalism that grinds all of this together and puts it in front of the viewer doesn't allow the viewer to have doesn't provide the viewer with the tools to be able to dissect it and say, this massive region, going back, the cradle of civilization where Abraham was from and so forth and so on, has so many different things to it that are not necessarily exactly the same, are very different. If it's like me coming to England saying, oh, but you must eat the same food in Hungary, or you must eat the same, drink the same beer in Poland. They're like, no, man, we're a different country, we're different parts of the continent, different language.
The problem with this racism that humans have, this tribalism, is it, especially when it becomes widespread in a culture, and then that culture is producing art, it is a self-perpetuating phenomenon that kind of goes deeper and deeper into craziness. And what's that article you shared with me the other day? It was about China, like recruiting PhDs and paying them or something. It was like, or what country was it?
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. Like, it was in Nature, and it was saying, it was like a big article, like saying, oh, Saudi Arabia is like recruiting PhDs and taking them from America and like paying them off to like work there. And I'm like, this is insane. It's in Nature, and it's exactly what the US has been doing for, like, I don't know, the last 100+ years. They just take PhDs from all around the world and bring them here and give them free stuff. Like that, it's so absurd. But to a person writing in Nature, they don't have to be paid directly by the CIA or some kind of nonsense. But I mean, it is, I don't know what editor would have thought to publish that, because it's insane. But anyway, their own bias, their own anti-Arab, like Oriental bias, makes it seem like that's a logical thing to report. Just like the guy who made Not Without My Daughter probably wasn't working for intelligence or even paid by an Israeli affiliate or Zionist to like demonize Iran, although likely they were, but they wouldn't have had to been. They could have just like felt so negatively about Iranians or about Muslims that this common thing that happens all around the world all the time in custody disputes. I mean, the story is not a unique thing. It happens everywhere, in even worse, like involving like murders of families and stuff. So they just picked this one thing and then characterized it as if it was a thing that happens in all Muslim, like it's just this horrible Muslim situation. And it's like really, really a bad taste. But that can happen because people are just so racist, and everyone supports that racism around them, so they don't realize that they're in this craziness. And all the propaganda stuff's like that now with Ukraine. The only way people hear, I mean, I talk openly about what I feel, and if I say something about Ukraine that goes against the propaganda, sometimes people will perk up and they'll be like, huh, tell me more about it. Because it's like the first time they heard anything outside of the echo chamber, and so I think part of it was interested in.
By the way, Not Without My Daughter, the parts that are supposed to be Iran were filmed in Israel, just to...
Okay, so...
Yeah.
just for your interest.
But, my point, and I'm saying, like, the culture can be so biased that they could say...
Yes, this is part of the... Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not always that people know and they are like distorting the realities or misrepresenting Iranians. It's sometimes that they're so propagandized that they actually believe in what they are offering. So yeah, that's a very good point. And that's when it becomes very dangerous. And I think unfortunately there are a lot of so-called Iranian expats that are a big part of that. Like they are the ones that are playing into that. They have left Iran more than 40 years ago, and Yeah, exactly. Native informants that just make everything more complicated. Okay, I think we have just a couple of minutes to wrap it up. Do you want to? Is there anything else you want to tell us about? I mean, it has been a very interesting discussion, and we can go on for another 2-3 hours probably, but because we're running out of time, is there anything that you want to say to?
Just thank you for the opportunity, and also the fact that when I was doing this research, Chris mentioned that before people had researched Muslims in film and stuff like that, but no one had really researched it to the depth that I'm doing now, and specifically these countries, and so, but within it, I also found anomalies, like I said, Three Kings. I would also encourage viewers to go and watch another film called The Beast of War, directed by Ryan, what's the name? Director of Waterworld and Robin Hood. He directed a very good movie where Afghans are not shown as victims, or they're not shown as they're shown as the protagonists. That in their own story. Americans don't come in to save them like in Rambo 3. But unfortunately, when Rambo 3 and that film came out the same year, the company that owns both put that into one cinema because it didn't have Sylvester Stallone in it and it wasn't going to make as much movie, and they pushed out Rambo 3, which we can talk about in another episode. But what I would suggest is there's so much more research that needs to be done to go in depth to unpack this stuff, and I'm hoping that I can turn my research into further articles that I'm writing and also book, and then people become more aware that it's quite widespread. It's you have it in mainstream TV, you have it in newspapers, you have it in the culture, like literature, and the films. Films is not just films; it's overall, like as we were discussing, where do they get these ideas when they come up with these stories? Jack Shaheen once said when he interviewed for his previous book before he passed away, he said to the producers, "Where do you get the ideas for these Arabs that you're putting in this series?" He goes, "Oh, whatever's on TV." So it's just recycling what they see and what they know without actually taking the time to go and find out the what's it called, diversity, and find out the truth of what the culture is before they put it into a movie.
Yeah,
but thank you so much.
If you met Jack, he was a very interesting guy. I met him here in Atlanta a couple times.
I wish I'd met him. He passed away, I think, 1 year before I started my PhD. But his work kind of.
You're carrying on his work. That's exactly what he would like to see done. So.
It's a great man.
Yeah, his book, his film A is for Arab, and then his book, his book A is for Arab, and then his film Real Bad Arabs, REEL. No, yeah, REEL, like a reel of a film, Real Bad Arabs, and A is for Arab is the book. Those two things are very, very interesting. So anyone here who wants to understand the depths of the propaganda space, in specifically targeting Arabs, which is very interesting if you're interested in the Palestine phenomenon and Israel, because that's Israel's first objective in manipulating U.S. culture was to turn Americans against Arabs. That could be then the Palestinian identity could be like homogenized into Arab identity, which everyone who knows Palestinians know there are actually Christian Palestinians. Jesus himself was a Christian. Was a Palestinian, and there are even Jewish Palestinians, some Sumerian Palestinians, and So anyway, the Jack Shaheen's work is really important understanding that, and then carrying it on into other regions like or other countries that are important to the U.S. war machine, I think is interesting. So that's great that you're doing that work, and it would be good to have you back on if we can talk about that afterwards.
Yeah, I just remembered also that you mentioned Rush Hour 3, which was produced in 2007, and that's where the Iranian scientists were dubbed as terrorists. And I think that's almost about the same years. That was during the Bush, right? Bush administration.
Just before Obama.
That's exactly. And I think that's probably when the Bush administration was training MEK in Nevada to assassinate Iranian nuclear scientists. So that tells you a lot about what is behind that.
That would make a good timeline. That would be an interesting timeline to set up the films of significance and the political.
Yep.
I'll add one thing before I go. In 2016, you can probably Google it, you see it. There's a tweet with a picture of John Kerry sitting with all of the Hollywood studio heads and saying, "We need your help against Daesh," right? To make people aware. Now, I'm still waiting for a flood of films to come out showing how America saved Iraq and Syria from Daesh.
They can't do it now.
So let's see. But we know that the American political establishment goes to visit these studios, and they kind of sprinkle the stuff around.
Yeah, but they also have to look at the reality of the information landscape, and they know that it would be impossible to produce a film like that without being like totally ripped apart, because there's so much information that's come out, and then thanks to, a lot of independent journalists who've exposed it, we know that the Islamic State thing was just a U.S. front. So
that's why they don't want to disappoint their
audiences.
Like
that's why they're getting pigeonholed into
not the audiences, but their allies, the ISIS allies that they have, because you're not going to depict them as.
Yeah, that's the problem with the information war. Like, this is the problem we're in. Like, we can expose the information war, you can expose the propaganda on the film, and then the more and more we expose, the less it's like these little less it's these puppet states or puppet organizations or criminal groups or rebel groups that the U.S. makes that they can then fight themselves. The more the U.S. is pigeonholed into actually having a global thermonuclear war as the only solution to keep fighting. So I don't know, but war is terrible, so we got to keep talking about it at some point. But yeah, they cannot make a film about how Daesh was defeated by America, because it's just like punching one puppet punching another puppet. It's not a very
exactly
truthful thing. But anyway, thanks for joining us on another episode of Twice Told Tales, and we'll put the links and description in the description so you can connect with our guest and his interesting research. We'll see you again next week.